The venue sparkled under bright lights, its red carpet gleaming like a promise of exclusivity. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns flowed seamlessly into the VIP entrance, their passes checked with swift precision. Amara Caldwell approached quietly, her black gown flowing effortlessly as she handed her pass to the security guard. He hesitated, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long, skepticism etched across his face. He held up the pass as if inspecting a counterfeit bill. "This pass doesn't look right," he said coldly, his tone sharp enough to cut through the chatter around them. Amara met his gaze without flinching. Her voice was calm but deliberate. "I am an invited guest." Another guard stepped forward, his tone sharper than the first. "VIP is for invited guests only." Nearby guests glanced at Amara, their whispers slicing through the air like knives. "Who is she?" one murmured to another. Amara stood firm, her silence louder than their judgment. The guards exchanged smirks, their confidence unshaken by her composure. Her thoughts were steady. "This isn't new, it's just louder here." The first guard handed back her pass with a curt nod. "Move along." Amara didn't budge. She tilted her head slightly and said, "You're making a mistake." The guard stiffened for a moment, their arrogance faltering briefly before they doubled down on their decision. Before they could reply, Amara turned and walked away toward another entrance, leaving them uneasy in her wake. The guard's hands trembled as he scanned the clipboard, sweat forming on his brow. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, their whispers sharp and cutting. "Well?" Amara asked calmly, her voice steady but unyielding. I don't see—" He stammered, his words faltering under the weight of the moment. A woman in the crowd interrupted, her voice clear and confident. "It's Caldwell Hall. Her name is on the sign outside." The guard froze mid-sentence. His partner stepped back slightly, muttering under his breath, "This is bad." Amara tilted her head, her composure unshaken. "Would you like me to call your manager?" The crowd erupted in whispers, their voices blending into a wave of realization. "She owns it! They messed with the wrong person!" The first guard stammered again, his arrogance unraveling. "Ma'am, we didn't realize—" Amara cut him off with a single sentence. "You didn't ask." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. The second guard fumbled with his radio, his voice shaky as he called for backup. A man in the crowd shouted, "Let her in!" Others echoed his sentiment, their support building like thunder. Amara raised her hand, slightly, quieting them instantly. Her tone was firm but calm. "This isn't about me," she said. "It's about everyone you've ever turned away for looking out of place." The guards exchanged panicked glances, their confidence crumbling under the weight of exposure. One muttered weakly, "We were just doing our jobs." Amara stepped closer and replied softly, "Your job is to protect people, not profiles." The crowd cheered as Amara turned and walked past the guards with quiet dignity. Amara moved through the venue's side entrance, her steps deliberate and composed. The cheers from the crowd outside faded into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of conversations. Guests near the bar glanced at her briefly, then quickly looked away, some out of discomfort, others out of complicity. A man pretending to scroll through his phone dropped it clumsily when Amara passed by. He scrambled to pick it up, avoiding her gaze entirely. Her thoughts were steady. It's easier for them to look away than to confront what's wrong. A server carrying a tray of champagne flinched slightly as Amara nodded at her. "Good evening," Amara said warmly, her tone calm but firm. The server forced a smile, her voice shaky. Good evening, Ms. Caldwell." Near the stage, a group of investors whispered urgently among themselves. "This could ruin the venue's reputation," one hissed, his voice sharp with panic. Another replied quietly, "Maybe it should." Amara paused briefly, catching fragments of their conversation before they fell silent under her gaze. Their unease was palpable. They couldn't meet her eyes. Behind her, One of the guards from earlier hurried past with his head down. "Ma'am?" he muttered weakly, barely audible. Amara didn't acknowledge him. Her thoughts sharpened. They'll learn or they'll leave. At the bar, a woman touched Amara's arm hesitantly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For earlier," Amara met her eyes without hesitation. "Don't apologize to me," she said evenly. "Do better." The woman nodded quickly, tears brimming in her eyes as she stepped away into the crowd. Amara scanned the room once more before continuing forward, her resolve unwavering. The hallway was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the venue's main lobby. Amara stepped through the staff entrance, her movements deliberate but unhurried. The muffled sound of the crowd outside lingered faintly in the background. Her assistant approached quickly, clutching a tablet tightly. "They're calling you a hero online," she said, holding up a tweet that read, "Caldwell Hall is where dignity lives." Amara glanced at the screen briefly, her expression calm but unreadable. "Heroes don't fix systems," she replied softly. "People do." She paused near an exit door, the city's hum seeping through the cracks. "Cancel my morning meetings," she added. "We're drafting new entry protocols." Her assistant nodded quickly. "Including bias training?" "Especially that," Amara said firmly, her tone carrying weight without volume. As they moved toward the parking lot, a janitor paused his mopping to smile at Amara. "Proud of you, Miss Caldwell," he said quietly. Amara returned his smile with warmth. "Thank you, Marcus." Outside, cameras flashed as reporters surrounded the venue's main entrance, their voices blending into a chaotic chorus of questions. Amara stopped just short of the crowd, watching them from the shadows. Her assistant hesitated beside her. "Should we address them?" "Not tonight," Amara replied calmly. "Let the story breathe." They walked toward her car under the cool night air. A young couple recognized Amara and waved shyly from across the street. She waved back briefly, before stepping into her car, exhaustion flickering across her face for just a moment. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister. "Mom would have loved this." Amara typed slowly. "She'd say it's just the start." As the car pulled away, she glanced back at the venue's glowing sign, Caldwell Hall. Her thoughts were quiet but fierce. "They'll never forget who I am." The memory was sharp, etched into Amara's mind like an old scar. She sat in a cramped office, her hands clutching a folder filled with projections, business plans, and dreams. Across the desk the banker smiled politely, a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is impressive work," he said, flipping through the pages without really looking, "but we're not sure your proposal fits our current lending criteria." Amara nodded slowly, her face calm even as her stomach tightened. She had heard this before, different words, same meaning. "You don't belong." It wasn't just rejection, it was dismissal disguised as professionalism. Another flashback followed. Amara, standing in a boardroom, presenting her idea to investors who nodded along but never committed. One leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "It's ambitious," he said, "but maybe you should start smaller." Amara's voice had been steady then. "I don't need smaller, I need support." The investors exchanged glances, their silence louder than any response could have been. Her mentor's advice echoed in her mind during those moments. If they won't let you in their rooms, build your own. Every rejection wasn't just a closed door. It was another brick in the foundation of what she would create. Years later, standing outside Caldwell Hall, Amara felt the weight of those moments pressing against her chest, not as pain, but as fuel. Her success wasn't born from acceptance. It was forged through exclusion. She whispered to herself softly, "They'll see me now." Amara stood in the hallway of a corporate office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She adjusted her blazer and clutched her portfolio tightly as she waited to be called in. The receptionist smiled at her, but it was the kind of smile that felt rehearsed, distant. When she finally entered the meeting room, The atmosphere was cold but professional. The panel of bankers sat behind a long table, their expressions neutral as they scanned her documents. "This is well prepared," one of them said, his tone measured. "But we're concerned about the risk involved." Amara's voice was calm, unwavering. "I've accounted for every risk in the projections you're holding." The man nodded, but didn't look up from the papers. "It's just not something we can move forward with at this time." The rejection wasn't about numbers, it was about perception. Another memory surfaced. Amara sitting across from an investor who leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "You're asking for a lot," he said casually. "Have you thought about scaling down?" Amara met his gaze evenly. "I'm asking for what it takes to succeed." He smiled faintly, a smile that felt condescending. "Ambition is admirable, but it doesn't always pay off." Their words weren't advice, they were barriers. Each rejection chipped away at something inside her, but it also strengthened her resolve. She learned to read between their polished excuses and empty praise. Standing outside Caldwell Hall years later, Amara reflected on those moments, not as failures, but as lessons. They didn't open their doors, she thought, so I built my own. The first time Amara unlocked the doors to her own venue, she stood in the empty lobby, letting the silence wash over her. The space was hers. Every brick, every beam, every detail had been chosen with purpose. It wasn't just a building, it was a statement. This wasn't about wealth or power. It was about belonging. The walls were adorned with art from local creators, the furniture arranged to invite conversation, not exclusion. The air felt warm, welcoming. Amara had designed it that way. When the first event was held, she stood near the entrance watching as guests walked in. A young woman hesitated at the door, her hands fidgeting nervously. Amara approached her with a smile. "You're in the right place," she said softly. The woman's shoulders relaxed as she stepped inside, her expression shifting from uncertainty to relief. Amara's spaces weren't just venues, they were havens for those who had been turned away elsewhere. Over time, Caldwell Hall became known for its inclusivity. Artists who had been overlooked found their work displayed prominently on its walls. Entrepreneurs who couldn't secure traditional meeting spaces hosted their events there without fear of judgment. Yet even as her venues thrived, Amara knew the world outside her doors hadn't changed. She saw it in the stories her guests shared, in their gratitude for a space that didn't question their worth. Her resolve grew stronger with each event, each conversation. If they won't open their doors, she thought, I'll keep building. More of mine. Standing in the lobby one evening, she whispered to herself, "Everyone belongs here." Amara stood near the entrance of Caldwell Hall, her gaze steady as she watched the guards interact with arriving guests. Their tone was sharp, their judgments swift. A man in a tailored suit handed over his pass and was waved through without hesitation. Moments later, a young couple approached, their clothing modest but elegant. The guard's expression hardened as he scrutinized their passes longer than necessary. "Are you sure these are valid?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. It wasn't just about protocol. It was about perception. The couple exchanged uneasy glances before nodding. "We were invited," the woman said softly. The guard sighed and waved them through reluctantly, his authority intact but fragile. Amara's jaw tightened as she observed the exchange, her thoughts sharp. "I've seen this before, too many times." Another guest approached, a man in casual attire with confidence in his stride. The guard stopped him immediately. "VIP access is for invited guests only," he said coldly, without even glancing at the pass extended toward him. The man frowned but didn't argue, stepping aside quietly. Years of assumptions and biases disguised. As authority played out in front of her, Amara stepped forward, her presence commanding but calm. The guards straightened slightly as she approached, their arrogance flickering under her gaze. She didn't speak immediately, letting the tension settle around them. Her voice broke the silence. "Do you always decide who belongs based on how they look?" The guards stiffened, exchanging uneasy glances but saying nothing. Amara didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked away, her resolve unshaken. Amara sat in her office late one evening, the glow of her desk lamp casting shadows across stacks of files. Each folder contained stories, complaints dismissed, reports ignored, patterns of exclusion justified as misunderstandings. She flipped through them slowly, her hands steady but her thoughts heavy. Systemic racism wasn't always loud. It thrived in silence, protected by protocol. One file stood out, a report from years ago detailing an incident at another venue. A black woman had been denied entry despite holding a valid ticket. The staff claimed she was disruptive, though witnesses described her as calm and polite. The complaint had been marked insufficient evidence and filed away without consequence. Amara's jaw tightened as she read the words. How many times had this happened? How many voices had been silenced? Another memory surfaced. Her own experience at a corporate gala years ago. She had arrived early, dressed impeccably, but the security guard stopped her at the door. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he had asked, his tone dripping with doubt. Amara's voice had been calm then. "I'm certain." The guard didn't apologize. He simply stepped aside, his arrogance intact. Back in the present, Amara closed the file and leaned back in her chair. Her resolve hardened as she stared at the glowing sign outside her window. Caldwell Hall. She whispered softly to herself, "Silence protects them, but not anymore." The next morning, she sent an email to her staff. "We're reviewing every protocol, every decision. No more excuses." Amara stood at the main entrance of Caldwell Hall, her presence commanding yet calm. The guards, who had dismissed her earlier, straightened as she approached. Their confidence wavered under her gaze, but they said nothing. "I need to speak to the event manager," Amara said evenly, her voice carrying just enough weight to leave no room for argument. The first guard hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio. He's busy right now," he mumbled. Amara didn't flinch. "Then unbusy him." The second guard exchanged a nervous glance with his partner before stepping aside to make the call. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken power shifts. Guests nearby watched the scene unfold in hushed silence. Some whispered quietly to one another, their curiosity growing. Others simply stared, their expressions a mix of unease and anticipation. Amara stood still, her composure unshaken. As she waited, her thoughts were steady. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been dismissed. A woman in a gold dress leaned toward her companion, whispering, "She's not backing down." The event manager arrived moments later, his steps hurried and his face flushed with discomfort. He adjusted his tie nervously as he approached Amara. "Ms. Caldwell, I wasn't informed you'd be here tonight." Amara's gaze didn't waver. "That's because your staff didn't ask." The manager opened his mouth to respond but faltered under the weight of her words. Amara continued, her tone deliberate. "This isn't about one mistake, it's about a pattern." The silence around them grew heavier as the manager struggled to find an answer. Amara didn't wait for one. The event manager stood awkwardly in front of Amara, his discomfort visible in the way he adjusted his tie and avoided her gaze. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding," he said weakly, his voice trembling slightly. Amara's expression remained calm, but her words cut through his excuse like a blade. "It's not a misunderstanding when it keeps happening." The guests nearby leaned in closer, their curiosity turning into quiet outrage. Phones were raised discreetly, capturing every word and movement. The manager stammered, I'll speak to the staff about this. It won't happen again." Amara tilted her head slightly, her tone sharp but restrained. "Won't it happen again? How many times has it already happened?" He froze, his lips parting as if to respond, but no words came out. His silence was louder than any defense he could muster. Excuses had always been the shield, but tonight they were crumbling under scrutiny. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably beside the manager, his confidence from earlier now replaced by quiet dread. He muttered under his breath, "We didn't know." Amara turned her gaze toward him, her voice steady but piercing. "You didn't ask." The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers growing louder as realization spread among them. A woman near the front whispered to her friend, "She's right, they never ask." The manager cleared his throat and tried again. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Amara stepped closer, her tone unwavering. "Make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The weight of her words hung in the air as the manager nodded stiffly, his authority unraveling in front of everyone. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down on every person present. Amara stood firm, her composure unshaken, while the whispers began to spread. "Isn't that Amara Caldwell?" a man near the bar murmured to his companion. "She owns this place," the companion replied, his voice barely audible but heavy with realization. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence unraveling as the murmurs grew louder. Guests leaned toward each other, their phones raised openly now, capturing every moment of the unfolding scene. Amara's voice cut through the noise, calm and deliberate. "I don't need your permission to enter my own venue." The crowd froze for a moment before erupting into hushed conversations. A woman whispered urgently to her friend, "She's the owner?" They really messed up. The guards stiffened under the weight of public scrutiny. One of them muttered weakly, "We didn't know." "You didn't ask," Amara replied evenly, her tone sharp enough to silence them further. A young man near the entrance whispered to his partner, "This is going viral." His partner nodded, already typing furiously. On her phone, the atmosphere shifted entirely as guests began recording and sharing clips online. The guards shrank under the weight of exposure, their authority crumbling with every whisper that echoed through the room. Amara turned toward the crowd briefly, her gaze steady but piercing. "Tonight isn't about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." Her words silenced even the whispers as she walked away calmly, leaving the guards frozen in place. The guards stood rooted in place, their once confident posture now slouched under the weight of the crowd's stares. Their eyes darted nervously, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Amara's words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. "You didn't ask." Guests continued to record, their phones pointed like quiet witnesses. A woman near the front whispered to her companion, "They don't know what to do now." The first guard cleared his throat, his voice barely audible. We were just following protocol." Amara turned slightly, her gaze steady but unyielding. "Protocol doesn't excuse ignorance." The second guard shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting with the radio on his belt. He opened his kiawi mouth to speak but stopped himself, his confidence crumbling under the weight of exposure. A man in a sharp suit stepped forward from the crowd, his tone sharp and cutting. "You should apologize." His words weren't loud, but they carried enough force to make the guards flinch. The first guard looked at Amara, his lips trembling as if forming words was suddenly impossible. He glanced at his partner for support, but none came. The silence between them spoke louder than any excuse they could muster. Amara didn't press them further. She didn't need to. The collapse of their authority was already complete. Every glance from the crowd, every phone recording their discomfort, every whisper of judgment had done the work for her. She turned back toward the venue's entrance and walked away with quiet dignity, leaving them standing there like statues in a crumbling facade. The videos hit social media within minutes, spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. Clips of Amara calmly stating, "I don't need your permission to enter my own venue," were juxtaposed with the guards' dismissive arrogance. The contrast was striking and the outrage was immediate. Comments flooded in under hashtags like outrage, Caldwell Hall, and discrimination. She handled that with so much grace. This happens every day, we just don't see it. They thought they could humiliate her, but she owned them instead. Amara sat in her office, watching the clips circulate. Her phone buzzed constantly, Texts, emails, notifications from people she hadn't heard from in years. She glanced at a message from a former colleague. "You've started something bigger than you realize." Her assistant entered quietly, holding a tablet. "It's everywhere," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "News outlets are picking it up now." Amara nodded slightly but didn't look up. Her thoughts were steady. "This isn't about me. It's about what comes next." Outside Caldwell Hall, protesters began to gather, holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "Stop profiling." The crowd grew steadily, their voices blending into chants that echoed down the street. The guards who had dismissed Amara earlier watched from inside the venue, their faces pale as they scrolled through their phones. One muttered weakly, "We're finished." Another replied bitterly, "We should be." Amara stood by her window, gazing at the growing crowd below. Her resolve was unshaken as she whispered softly to herself, "Let them see everything." Amara's face filled the screens of phones, laptops, and televisions across the country. The videos of her calm defiance and the guards' dismissive arrogance struck a nerve. But it wasn't just her story that resonated, it was the flood of others that followed. Underneath the viral clips, comments poured in. "This happened to me last year at a restaurant. I was told I didn't belong in a store I've shopped at for years. They always assume we're out of place." A teacher posted her story. "I was denied entry to a gala because they didn't believe my ticket was real." Watching Amara stand her ground gave me courage to share this. A nurse shared, "I was followed around a boutique until I left. They didn't even bother hiding it. We've all been Amara at some point." The stories multiplied, each one adding weight to the growing demand for accountability. News anchors discussed the incident with solemn tones, replaying the footage again and again. Amara sat at her desk, scrolling through the messages on her phone. Each one carried a different tone, gratitude, anger, hope, but all shared the same underlying truth. This wasn't just about one moment. Her assistant entered quietly, holding a stack of printed emails. "These are from people who want to support you," she said softly. "They're calling you a symbol." Amara shook her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not a symbol, I'm a reminder." She set her phone down and glanced out the window at Caldwell Hall's glowing sign. The world was finally listening, but Amara knew this was just the beginning. Investigations began quietly, but they didn't stay that way for long. The viral videos of Amara's confrontation had sparked outrage, and now the spotlight was on more than just Caldwell Hall. Reports surfaced of similar incidents at other, high-profile venues, stories of racial profiling, denied access, and subtle exclusions that had gone unchecked for years. A journalist released an exposé titled "The Protocol Problem," detailing patterns of misconduct across corporate-owned spaces. Complaints dismissed as misunderstandings, security protocols used to justify bias, and victims silenced by bureaucracy. The article ended with a haunting line. How many voices were ignored before Amara Caldwell made them listen? Amara watched the news unfold from her office, her laptop screen filled with headlines. Corporate racism under scrutiny. Victims speak out after viral incident. Change is coming to public spaces. Her assistant entered briskly, holding a folder marked Legal Review. "They're auditing every venue under this company," she said. "Complaints are pouring in from all over." Amara nodded slowly, her thoughts steady. This isn't just about Caldwell Hall. It's about every door that's been closed without reason. Outside the venue, protesters continued to gather, their signs growing more pointed, "No more excuses" and "Accountability now." Inside Caldwell Hall, the guards who had dismissed Amara earlier sat alone in a back room. Their radios were silent, their authority stripped away. One muttered bitterly, "We should have seen this coming." Another replied quietly, "It was always going to catch up to us." Amara stood by her window once again, watching the crowd below. She whispered softly to herself, "Let the system burn if it can't be rebuilt." Supporters gathered outside Caldwell Hall, their voices blending into a steady hum of anticipation. Signs waved in the air, bold letters reading, "Justice for all" and "End discrimination." The crowd stretched across the street, spilling into nearby sidewalks as chants began to rise. Cameras flashed incessantly as reporters jostled for position near the podium. Microphones were set up hastily, their cords snaking across the pavement. The energy was electric, charged with anger and hope in equal measure. Amara stepped out of the building and onto the stage, her movements deliberate, yet calm. The crowd quieted instantly, their chants fading into silence as all eyes turned toward her. Her black suit reflected the sunlight, a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. A young girl in the front row clutched a homemade sign that read, "We belong here." She stared at Amara with wide eyes, her grip tightening around the edges of the cardboard. Amara's gaze swept across the crowd, taking in their faces, some determined, others weary but resolute. She adjusted the microphone slightly, her hands steady despite the weight of expectation pressing down on her. The silence deepened, thick with anticipation. Even the reporters stopped whispering, their pens poised above notebooks. Amara leaned forward slightly and spoke her first words. "This isn't just about me." Her voice carried through the crowd like a ripple, soft but powerful enough to command their attention completely. The girl in the front row wiped away a tear silently as Amara continued. "It's about every time someone was made to feel they didn't belong." The crowd remained silent, their focus unbroken as Amara prepared to deliver what they had all been waiting for. Amara stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges. The crowd remained silent, their anticipation palpable. She took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she began to speak. "This isn't about one incident," she said, her voice clear and deliberate. "It's about every time someone was made to feel like they didn't belong. It's about every door that was closed without reason." Her words rippled through the crowd, silencing even the most cynical reporters. A man in the middle row lowered his camera, his focus shifting from capturing the moment to simply listening. Amara continued, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just my story. It's yours. It's hers." She gestured toward a woman holding a sign that read, "No more profiling." The woman nodded quietly, tears glistening in her eyes. A protester near the front wiped away a tear silently, his sign trembling slightly in his hands. Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but piercing. "Systemic racism isn't always loud. It thrives in silence, in excuses, in ignorance disguised as protocol. And today, we end that silence." The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising like thunder. Reporters scrambled to jot down her words, their pens moving furiously across their notebooks. Amara waited for the noise to settle before delivering her final line. "This isn't about anger. It's about accountability." The applause swelled, again, louder this time, carrying with it a wave of hope and determination. Amara stepped back slightly from the podium, her presence commanding yet calm as she watched the crowd absorb her message. The applause faded, leaving an expectant silence. In its wake, reporters raised their hands, their voices overlapping as they tried to catch Amara's attention. She stood firm at the podium, her gaze steady as she gestured for one of them to speak. A reporter in a gray blazer stepped forward, his tone sharp, but curious. "Do you think this was intentional?" Amara paused, letting the question settle in the air. Her composure didn't falter as she replied firmly, "Intent doesn't matter when harm is done." The crowd murmured in agreement, their whispers carrying the weight of shared experiences. The reporter hesitated before sitting back down, his pen frozen above his notebook. Another reporter stood quickly, her voice softer but no less direct. "What changes do you want to see from venues like this?" Amara leaned forward slightly, her voice deliberate and clear. "Accountability, not apologies. I want systems that protect people, not excuses that protect bias." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. A man near the back of the crowd nodded silently, his expression thoughtful. A third reporter spoke hesitantly, his voice tinged with discomfort. "Do you think this will lead to real change?" Amara's gaze shifted toward him, her tone unwavering. "Change doesn't come from promises, it comes from action. And today is just the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause once more, their voices rising with renewed energy. Amara stepped back slightly from the podium, her presence commanding yet calm as she watched the reporters scribble furiously in their notebooks. Behind her, a protester whispered to another, "She's not just speaking, she's making them listen." The press conference had ended, but its ripples were only beginning. Inside Caldwell Hall, the atmosphere was tense, the once bustling staff now subdued. Investigators arrived quietly, their presence heavy as they began reviewing past complaints. Files that had been buried under insufficient evidence were pulled from dusty cabinets. Reports of racial profiling incidents resurfaced, each one a reminder of a system that had protected its own at the expense of others. In the hallways, staff members avoided eye contact with one another. Conversations were hushed, their words careful and deliberate. One officer muttered to his colleague, "They brought this on themselves." His colleague nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but heavy with judgment. "We all knew it was wrong," she replied quietly. The guards who had dismissed Amara earlier sat alone at their desks, their confidence replaced by quiet dread. One stared blankly at his computer screen, the cursor blinking on an empty report. He couldn't bring himself to write. A senior staff member walked past without stopping, his gaze fixed forward as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of what was happening around him. The silence wasn't neutral, it was judgment. Amara's words echoed faintly in their minds. Intent doesn't matter when harm is done. Outside the venue, protesters continued to gather, their chants growing louder as more people joined them. The signs they held were sharper now. No more excuses and end systemic racism. Inside Caldwell Hall, the walls seemed to close in around those who had once felt untouchable. The system wasn't just cracking, it was unraveling. The break room was unusually quiet, the hum of the vending machine the only sound cutting through. The tension. Staff members huddled in small groups, their voices barely above whispers. "They're reviewing every complaint now," one said, his tone low but urgent. Another replied, her arms crossed tightly. "We all knew this would happen." Eventually, the guards who had dismissed Amara earlier sat at a corner table, isolated from the rest. Their once boastful demeanor had vanished, replaced by quiet dread. One of them stared at his coffee cup, turning it slowly in his hands as if searching for answers at the bottom. "I didn't think it would go this far," he muttered weakly. His partner shook his head, his voice bitter but resigned. "It was always going to catch up to us." A supervisor entered the room, her steps deliberate but heavy. She glanced at the guards briefly before turning away, her expression unreadable. The whispers grew louder as she left, carrying fragments of judgment and unease. "They're pulling files from years ago," someone said near the vending machine. "Even the ones we thought were closed." Another voice chimed in. "They're not just looking at us, they're looking at everyone." The guards exchanged a glance but said nothing, their silence speaking louder than any defense they could muster. Outside the break room, footsteps echoed down the hallway as investigators moved between offices, their presence impossible to ignore. The staff's confidence crumbled further with each passing moment. Amara's words lingered in their minds. Accountability, not apologies. The break room wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. The videos from Amara's press conference flooded social media, spreading faster than anyone could contain. Her calm resolve and piercing words were juxtaposed with the guards' dismissive arrogance, creating a stark contrast that ignited outrage. Under the hashtag #InChu Not Just One Venue, stories poured in from all corners of the country. "This happened to me at a restaurant last year. They told me I wasn't dressed appropriately, but it was just an excuse. I've been turned away so many times. I stopped trying." A viral clip showed Amara standing at the podium, her voice steady. "This isn't about anger, it's about accountability. Another video captured the guards' unease as they realized who she was. The internet dissected every moment, every expression. She handled it with so much grace. They thought they could humiliate her, but she owned them instead. This is what systemic racism looks like. It's not always loud, but it's always there. Amara sat at her desk, her phone buzzing incessantly with notifications. She scrolled through hundreds of messages, some from strangers thanking her for speaking up, others sharing their own experiences of exclusion and bias. Her assistant entered, with a tablet in hand, her expression a mix of awe and urgency. "It's everywhere now," she said. "News outlets are picking it up. They're calling it a movement." Amara looked up briefly, her voice calm but firm. "Movements don't end with one story, they begin with many." Outside Caldwell Hall, protesters held signs with the hashtag, "Not just one venue." Their chants echoed down the street, growing louder, with each passing hour. Amara stood by the window, watching them march. Her thoughts were steady. Let them see everything. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an uneasy stillness. A senior staff member sat at his desk, staring at a blank resignation letter on his screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as he typed the final words, "Effective immediately." He printed the letter and placed it, neatly in an envelope, his movements deliberate but heavy. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but he didn't hesitate. He knew this moment had been coming for a long time. By noon his desk was cleared. His nameplate, once polished and prominent, was gone, leaving behind only a faint outline on the wood. Colleagues passed by without stopping, their glances fleeting but filled with quiet judgment. "He's just the first," someone whispered. "Near the break room," another replied softly. "We all knew it would come to this." The guards who had dismissed Amara earlier sat at their desks nearby, their eyes fixed on their screens but their focus elsewhere. One of them glanced at the empty desk and muttered under his breath, "It's starting." The resignation wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. The empty space spoke louder than any formal statement could have. Amara stood by her office window, watching as the man left the building with his box of belongings. She didn't know his name, but she recognized the look on his face, regret mixed with resignation. Her assistant entered quietly, holding a folder. "Another one gone," she said softly. Amara nodded but didn't turn away from the window. Her voice was calm yet resolute. "There will be more." The floodgates had opened. Across social media, victims of past discrimination began sharing their stories, each one echoing the same pain and exclusion Amara had faced. A teacher posted, "I was barred from a gala because they said my ticket wasn't valid. I didn't argue. I just left." Watching Amara stand her ground gave me the courage to share this. A nurse wrote, "I was followed around a store by security until I finally walked out. They didn't even try to hide it." We've all been Amara at some point. The stories multiplied, each one amplifying the movement and adding weight to the demand for change. Under hashtags like Niatur, not just one venue, and the We Belong Here, people from all walks of life came forward with their experiences of being dismissed, profiled, or excluded without cause. Amara scrolled through the posts late at night, her phone glowing softly in the darkened room. Each story carried its own tone, anger, sadness, hope, but all shared a common thread. They were tired of being silent. Her assistant entered quietly, holding a stack of printed messages. "These are from people who want to thank you," she said softly. "They say you gave them courage." Amara placed her phone down and took the stack of papers, flipping through them slowly. Her voice was calm but firm. "It's not about courage. It's about knowing you deserve better." Outside Caldwell Hall, protesters marched with signs that read, "Our voices matter," and "End the silence." The movement had grown beyond Amara's control. It was no longer just her story. It was everyone's. She stood by her window, watching the crowd below. Her thoughts were steady. This is what change looks like. The boardroom was suffocatingly quiet, the air thick with tension. Executives sat around the polished table, their faces pale and drawn. The CEO stared at his laptop, the screen filled with trending hashtags. Not just one venue, and now and discrimination. "They're tearing us apart online," one executive said, his voice breaking the silence. Another snapped, his frustration barely contained. "What did you expect? We ignored this for too long." The CEO leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but heavy with regret. "It's too late for damage control," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "A marketing." Director shuffled through papers nervously. "We could issue a statement, acknowledge the incident, and promise reform." The room erupted into murmurs, some nodding while others shook their heads. One executive slammed his fist on the table. "A statement won't fix this. People want accountability, not promises we won't keep." The silence returned, heavier than before. The CEO glanced at the reports in front of him. Complaints that had been buried, incidents dismissed as misunderstandings. Each one was now a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. "Start reviewing everything," he said finally, his tone resigned. "Every complaint, every protocol, if we don't fix this now, we won't survive it." The room remained tense as the meeting ended. Executives filed out slowly, their confidence shattered. Outside Caldwell Hall, protesters continued to march, their chants growing louder. "No more excuses!" The sound echoed through the streets, reaching even the boardroom's thick walls. Amara watched from her office window, her gaze steady as she whispered softly to herself. "They're listening now." Amara stood at her office window, the early morning sunlight casting long shadows across the room. Below, the street was alive with movement. Protesters marching with signs, their chants echoing through the city. The energy was different now. It wasn't just anger. It was resolved. Her assistant entered quietly, holding a cup of coffee. "The crowd's still growing," she said softly. "What now?" Amara didn't turn from the window. Her voice was calm but firm. "Now they listen." She sipped her coffee slowly, her gaze fixed on Caldwell Hall's nameplate gleaming in the sunlight. The building wasn't just here, it was a symbol now, a place where belonging had been reclaimed and dignity restored. Outside, a young girl held a sign that read, "Thank you, Amara." She waved it proudly as her mother stood beside her, smiling, faintly. Amara's chest tightened slightly at the sight, but she didn't let the emotion show. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her. A message from an old mentor. "You've done more than build a business. You've built a legacy." Amara picked up the phone and typed slowly, "It's not mine. It's ours." The camera panned to the protesters below, neighbors exchanging smiles, children playing freely near the venue's steps, and strangers united by a shared purpose. The chants softened into quiet conversations as people began to connect in ways they hadn't before. Amara stepped away from the window and placed her coffee on the desk. She whispered softly to herself, "This is just the beginning." The camera lingered on Caldwell Hall's nameplate one last time, its glow steady against the bright sky, a legacy that couldn't be erased. The lobby of Caldwell Hall was transformed, its usual grandeur softened into a space of quiet connection. Community leaders and residents filled the room, their voices low but purposeful. Chairs were arranged in small circles, inviting conversation rather than formality. Amara stood near the center, her presence steady and unassuming. She wasn't here to lead. She was here to listen. A woman in a green scarf spoke softly to the group around her. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I've never felt welcome in spaces like this." Her voice wavered slightly, but her resolve was clear. Another resident nodded, his tone firm but reflective. "It's not just about feeling welcome, it's about knowing we belong here." Amara moved quietly between groups, stopping to hear snippets of their stories. Each voice carried its own weight, stories of exclusion, moments of humiliation, ideas for change. Near the entrance, a young man hesitated before speaking. "We need spaces where people don't have to prove they deserve to be here." His words rippled through the room, drawing murmurs of agreement. Amara's gaze shifted toward him briefly, her expression unreadable but thoughtful. The air was filled with a sense of purpose, not anger, but determination to build something better. Amara's thoughts were steady. This is what progress looks like, not loud declarations, but quiet resolve. She stepped back slightly, letting the conversations flow naturally around her. Caldwell Hall wasn't just a venue tonight, it was a haven for voices that had been silenced for too long. Amara stood near the edge of the room, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, observing as conversations unfolded around her. The hum of voices filled the space, weaving stories of pain, resilience, and hope. A young woman approached hesitantly, clutching a notebook tightly to her chest. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as though she were gathering courage with each one. When she finally reached Amara, she stopped and looked down for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "For standing up. For all of us." Amara's gaze softened as she met the young woman's eyes. She nodded gently, her voice calm but carrying weight. "This is just the beginning." The woman's shoulders relaxed, and a faint smile crossed her face. She clutched the notebook tighter for a moment before stepping back into the crowd, her movements lighter than before. Amara watched her go, her thoughts steady. Sometimes it's not about what you say, it's about what they feel when they leave. Nearby, an older man caught the exchange and nodded quietly to himself. The room seemed to shift slightly, the energy growing warmer as others noticed the interaction. Amara turned her attention back to the groups around her. The stories continued to flow, some hesitant, others bold, but all carried a sense of shared purpose. The young woman glanced back at Amara once before leaving the room entirely, her expression no longer hesitant but resolute. Amara stood still for a moment longer, letting that small moment settle within her. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it didn't need to be. In the corner of the room, an older man stood surrounded by a small group. His voice was steady, but his words carried years of pain and reflection. "We've been silent too long," he said firmly, his gaze moving from one person to the next. "It's time we start looking out for each other." The group nodded quietly, their expressions a mix of agreement and regret. A woman beside him added softly, "I used to think staying quiet was safer, but now I see. It only makes things worse." Amara lingered nearby, her presence unobtrusive but intentional. She watched as the man's words rippled through the group, drawing murmurs of understanding and resolve. Another man spoke hesitantly, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "I've seen it happen so many times. People turned away because they didn't look like they belonged, and I never said anything." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have." The older man placed a hand on his shoulder briefly, a quiet gesture of solidarity. "We all should have," he replied. Amara's expression remained unreadable as she observed the exchange, but her thoughts were reflective. Change doesn't come from one voice. It comes from many. The group fell silent for a moment, their shared understanding hanging in the air like an unspoken promise. Amara stepped closer, her voice calm but deliberate. "What matters now is what you do next." The older man nodded slowly, his resolve evident in the way he straightened his posture. "We'll do better," he said simply. Amara didn't reply. She didn't need to. The weight of their shared stories was already shifting into something stronger. Amara stood near the entrance, her gaze sweeping across the room as conversations unfolded. The hum of voices was steady, filled with quiet determination. A young boy walked in with his mother, his small hand gripping hers tightly. His eyes darted around the space, wide with curiosity. As they passed by Amara, the boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered loudly enough for her to hear, "Is she the one who owns this place?" His mother glanced at Amara briefly before nodding. Yes, she replied softly. The boy stopped walking and stared at Amara, his wide eyes filled with wonder. He smiled shyly, but quickly hid behind his mother's leg, peeking out cautiously. Amara crouched slightly to meet his gaze, her voice gentle but firm. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated for a moment before replying quietly, "Eli." "Well, Eli," Amara said with a faint smile, "this place belongs to everyone, including you." The boy's face lit up as he stepped out from behind his mother's leg. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief and excitement. Amara nodded. "Really?" His mother placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled warmly at Amara. "Thank you," she said softly. Amara straightened and returned the smile briefly before watching them walk further into the room. Her thoughts were steady. It's not just about reclaiming spaces, it's about showing the next generation they belong. Eli glanced back at Amara once more before disappearing into the crowd, his small smile lingering long after he was gone. Amara stood near the edge of the room, her focus shifting between the quiet conversations around her. The energy in the lobby was warm but reflective, each voice carrying stories of pain and hope. She was about to move toward another group when she noticed a man approaching hesitantly. His steps were slow, almost reluctant, as if he wasn't sure whether to continue or turn back. Amara recognized him immediately. He had been at a previous event, one where he had ignored her entirely despite her attempts to engage. He stopped a few feet away, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. He didn't speak, but his eyes met hers briefly before darting away again. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. Amara remained still, her expression calm but unreadable. She didn't offer him an easy way out, letting the silence stretch, just long enough for him to feel its weight. Finally, he gave a small nod, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed by anyone else. It wasn't avoidance, it was acknowledgement, a quiet apology that carried years of complicity and regret. Amara inclined her head slightly in return, her gaze steady but not unkind. She didn't need words to understand what he was trying to say. The man turned and walked away quickly, disappearing into the crowd without another glance. Amara's thoughts were clear. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. She shifted her attention back to the room, her resolve unshaken. The moment wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Late that night, the lobby of Caldwell Hall was quiet again, the conversations and footsteps of the evening replaced by stillness. Amara sat alone in her office, the glow of her phone illuminating her face. She scrolled through message after message, each one carrying a different tone, but the same underlying truth. You gave us courage. Thank you for standing up when so many of us couldn't. This isn't just your fight, it's ours too. Some messages were short, raw with emotion. I've been there. Others were longer, recounting stories of exclusion, humiliation, and resilience. Amara leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but heavy with reflection. She set her phone down briefly and glanced at the stack of printed letters on her desk, messages from people who had written to thank her, to share their own experiences, or simply to say they believed in what she was doing. Her assistant had left them earlier with a quiet remark. "You've started something bigger than you." Amara picked up one letter and read it slowly. It was from a young woman who wrote, "I've spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong. Watching you stand your ground made me realize I don't have to feel that way anymore." Amara placed the letter back on the stack carefully, her thoughts steady. It's not about being a voice for others, it's about helping them find their own. She glanced out the window at the city skyline, its lights flickering against the dark sky. The messages weren't just gratitude, they were reminders of how much work was still left to do. Amara stood by her office window, the city skyline stretching out before her. The lights flickered softly against the night sky, illuminating streets that were still alive with movement. Below, Caldwell Hall stood tall, its nameplate glowing faintly in the darkness. Her thoughts were steady but reflective as she gazed at the scene. This isn't just about reclaiming spaces, it's about reshaping them. The events of the evening replayed in her mind, the quiet conversations, the hesitant apologies, the stories shared by people who had spent years feeling invisible. Each moment carried weight, building toward something larger than herself. Her phone buzzed on the desk behind her, but she didn't turn to check it. She knew what it would say. More messages of support, more stories of exclusion, more voices joining the growing movement. Amara's gaze shifted to the protesters still gathered outside Caldwell Hall. Their chants had softened into quiet conversations, their signs now resting against their sides as they spoke to one another. The energy wasn't loud anymore. It was purposeful. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The humiliation she'd endured, the silence she'd refused to accept, and the quiet resolve that had carried her through it all. Amara whispered softly to herself, "This is what change looks like." Her assistant entered quietly, holding a folder marked "Next Steps." Amara didn't turn from the window as she said calmly, "Tomorrow we start again." The camera lingered on her reflection in the glass before panning out to the skyline, a world beginning to shift under her unflinching gaze. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. Amara turned away from the window, her reflection fading into the darkness behind her. The weight of the day pressed against her shoulders, but she carried it with the same quiet strength that had brought her this far. She walked slowly to her desk, her fingers brushing against the stack of letters and her still buzzing phone. The messages were endless, stories, gratitude, calls for change, but for now she let them rest. Amara sat down, leaning back in her chair as she closed her eyes briefly. Her thoughts drifted to the faces she had seen that evening, the young boy who smiled shyly at her, the woman clutching her notebook, the man who offered a silent apology. Each moment felt small in isolation, but together they were monumental. Her gaze shifted to Caldwell Hall's nameplate visible through the window. The letters glowed softly in the night, a quiet reminder of what she had built and what it now stood for. Amara whispered softly under her breath, "They'll never forget who I am." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of years of struggle and triumph. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise. She stood once more and walked back to the window, her reflection merging with the city lights beyond. The world outside wasn't perfect, it was far from it, but tonight it felt just a little closer to something better. The camera panned upward, capturing the bold letters of the nameplate, Caldwell Hall. The glow from the sign wasn't harsh. It was steady, warm, and unyielding against the night sky. Amara stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the city lights. Her gaze rested on the sign, its presence a quiet declaration of everything she had fought for. This wasn't just a building. It was a symbol. It wasn't about her name etched in metal. It was about what it represented. For every person who had been turned away, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, Caldwell Hall now stood as proof that spaces could be reclaimed and dignity restored. Outside, the last few protesters lingered, their signs resting against their legs as they exchanged quiet words. One woman pointed at the sign and smiled faintly. "That name means something now," she said softly to her companion. Inside, Amara's thoughts were steady. This isn't just mine. It's theirs too. The glow of the nameplate reflected faintly in her eyes as she stepped away from the window. She didn't need to stare at it any longer. She knew what it meant, and what it would continue to mean long after tonight. The camera lingered on the sign for a moment longer before pulling back, revealing Caldwell Hall standing tall against the skyline. Its light didn't dominate. It simply existed, unwavering and undeniable. The morning sun bathed Caldwell Hall in a soft golden light. The streets outside were alive with quiet activity, residents walking freely into the venue without hesitation, children laughing as they chased each other near its steps, and neighbors exchanging warm smiles as they passed by. Inside, The lobby was filled with life. A group of community leaders sat in a circle, their voices low but purposeful as they discussed plans for future events. Nearby, a young artist hung her work on the walls, her hands trembling slightly with excitement. Amara walked through the space slowly, taking it all in. She paused briefly to greet a man who had just entered with his family. "Welcome," she said warmly, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity that put him at ease. The venue wasn't just hers anymore, it belonged to everyone who stepped through its doors. As she moved toward the center of the room, her thoughts were, "Steady! This isn't about one moment. It's about creating many more." The camera shifted to capture a montage of quiet moments. A child drawing on a piece of paper while sitting cross-legged on the floor. An elderly woman laughing softly as she shared a story with new friends. A group of teenagers brainstorming ideas for their first community project. Amara's voice echoed faintly in the background. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us." The final shot lingered on Caldwell Hall's nameplate, glowing brightly under the sunlight. A legacy reclaimed not just for Amara, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong.